Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 2 on Elizabethan England. Now, the first video we just did a general introduction and looked at the Tudors. What we're going to start looking at now in detail, ladies and gentlemen, for the rest of these videos, we're going to look at the years 1558 to 1588, 30 years of Elizabeth's reign, and that's the sort of thing they will ask you questions on in the exam, those 30 years. So, this one is all about England 1558, the start of Elizabeth's reign. What was English society like at that time? And also, what was the government like at that time? Society and government. 2 parts to this video. Now, remember, England's population was round about 3, maybe 4 million. But it was ordered. It was a very, very structured society. Everybody obeyed the person or the rank or the order above them. Some of you might remember back to some work you did in history in year 7. 1066, Battle of Hastings. Duke William of Normandy came over and became King of England, William the Conqueror. And one of the things he introduced was something called the feudal system. You may have seen, your teachers may have shown you something like this. A triangle showing how the feudal system worked. Well, here we are, 500 years later, and England was still based on that sort of thing. England was a hierarchy. And what we mean by that is a society that was very, very ordered and divided. Very, very structured. Now, 3 or 4 million people, most of whom, 90% maybe, lived in the countryside. But the towns were beginning to grow. Trade was beginning and England was becoming quite a rich country. But there was a division between the very rich and the very poor, and that caused problems for Elizabeth that we'll look at later. Poverty. What did she do about that? That's a later video, ladies and gentlemen. Now, how was society ordered? What was this hierarchy? Well, you can either refer to it as the Triangle of Triumph or the Pyramid of Power, whichever you can remember. And there we have it. At the top, of course, is God. Underneath, we have the monarch, the king or the queen. Now, one God, one king or queen. These figures here are families. So, underneath the king or queen, in this case 1558, Queen Elizabeth, underneath the queen, there were about 50 families, 50 noble or lords. They were very powerful, very wealthy. Queen Elizabeth used these people to help her run the country. So we have a division. As you work your way down, you get poorer and poorer. Or as you work your way up, you get richer and richer and more powerful. So Elizabeth at the top, getting her power from God, the idea that Elizabeth ruled by the grace of God. It was called the divine right of kings or queens. And the king or queen therefore said, everybody has to do what we say because we get our power from God. The divine right of kings, in brackets, queens. So we have God. We have Queen Elizabeth. We have 50 families, very rich, powerful nobles or lords. Underneath that, there are 10,000 families. Gentry, not as rich, not as powerful, they didn't own as much land, but they are still powerful and rich people. 10,000 families, knights, lesser nobles. Work your way down. 30,000 families who were wealthy merchants, traders, maybe people living in the cities, people living in the ports, wealthy merchants. They were a growing group in Elizabeth's reign. Work your way down again. The yeomen, maybe people who owned their own land. Below them, tenant farmers, people who rented the land, maybe from some of these people up here. And there were about 100,000 families of yeomen and farmers. And then at the bottom, where most people were, 500,000 families, the labourers, craftsmen, the poor. Now, some of these lived in towns, maybe working in the textiles or leather. Some of them worked in the countryside, working on the farms for these people, the farmers, the gentry. Maybe right at the bottom, you get the very, very poor, people who had no homes, vagrants as they were known. So that was English society in 1558, ladies and gentlemen. Okay? If you wish, you can use that. Okay, I'll leave it there for you. You can pause this and have a look at it. That was English society when Elizabeth became Queen in 1558. Now, that's the first part. Society. What England was like. The second part, government. How did Elizabeth rule this country? How did she, as Queen, govern this country? Now remember, I said she ruled by the grace of God, divine right of kings. Religion was very, very important in England in the 1500s. We'll see that very, very clearly in some of the next few videos. Elizabeth, as Queen, made the important decisions. Now, she would take advice before she made these decisions. And who would she take advice from? The people towards the top of the pyramid of power. The triangle of triumph. The nobles, the lords. And there's about 20 of them. The real top people, the top advisors. And they were known as the Privy Council. They would talk to and advise Elizabeth. But Elizabeth made the final decision. And even if the Privy Council did not agree, they would have to go along with what Elizabeth said. She's the ruler. The only person above her, or the only thing above her, God. So the Privy Council were important. William Cecil, a top advisor, a chief advisor, sometimes called a Secretary of State, member of the Privy Council, close advisor to Elizabeth. We'll mention him in later videos. So Elizabeth, she's the Queen of the country. She's head of the Church of England. More on that later. She's in charge of the law courts. She's in charge of governing the country. But she can't do it all on her own. Who will she rely on? Well, the Privy Council, but others as well. Elizabeth did call Parliament. Now, a word of warning. Parliament today are members of Parliament, are MPs. They make the laws today. But it wasn't like that in Elizabeth's time. Elizabeth, in the 30 years that we're studying, 1558 to 1588, she actually called Parliament about 10 times. That's about once every 3 years. Now, Parliament was made up of, obviously, the richer people. Okay? The lords, the bishops, maybe some of the merchants. There's about 450 of them. They got elected, but again, it's not like now where everybody over the age of 18 can vote. Very, very few people could vote back then. It was mainly the rich. When Parliament was called to London, to the Houses of Parliament by Elizabeth, it was normally so that Elizabeth would say, right, I need some money, I need some taxes. Please agree with me, sign this law and I can collect the taxes. So Parliament was more to do what Elizabeth said at that time. So she's at the top. The Privy Council, remember I've said those, 20 people, advisors, councillors, they met Elizabeth maybe 2 or 3 times every week. They gave advice, but they had to listen to her decision. Now, if Elizabeth is making the key decisions, what sort of decisions will she make? Well, the important ones, war or peace. If England was going to go to war, Elizabeth made the decision after taking advice. She could call and dismiss Parliament. She had the power, the sceptre, the crown, the symbols of her power. Parliament would vote, but she could agree the vote or she could reject it. She is in charge. She would grant titles to the lords, the nobles. She would give land. She could grant money. She could grant the top jobs. That is called patronage. 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 She's in charge of all of these. And she can say, well, I'll give you a good job. Now, why would Elizabeth do that? Why would she give patronage, land, titles? Any ideas? Well, here's a couple to think about. It's a way of controlling the people below. Right, I will give you that. In return, you help me. You run that little bit of the country, or you take over that court for me. So she's in charge and she's getting people on her side. Now, remember, Parliament is called by Elizabeth. They normally would agree taxes, of course, for example, for war. And then they would pass the laws called Acts of Parliament. They would offer advice. If they were too critical, Elizabeth had the power to say, right, you're criticising me, off to the Tower of London for a little bit. Off you go to prison, young man, and have a think about how you dare to criticise me, because I get my power from God. Right at the very top. So this is the way Elizabeth controls the country. Now, there are also a group of people called Lords Lieutenants, and they're in every county in England. And they're normally nobles or lords, rich, and they're almost like a little ruler in that area, ruling for Elizabeth. It's almost as if they are in charge of local government, raising and training local militia, almost like a little army. England didn't have an army like we do today. If England or Elizabeth needed soldiers, she would go to these people and say, right, bring some of your local men. So they were in charge, the Lords Lieutenants were in charge of training and raising these local militia, like a little local army. The Lords Lieutenants carried out her policies. So they're quite important. And then you get the JPs, Justices of the Peace. Again, large landowners. They did an important job for Elizabeth. Number one, it was unpaid. So only the rich people could afford to do this job, JPs. Although it was unpaid, it was high status. They had a high position in society. People looked up to them. Oh, the JP, he's important. He's an important man. So they had a good position in society. Now, what did they do? Well, what happens today if there's a crime? Someone commits a crime. What do we do today? Of course, we call the police. Quick, officer, there's been a crime. I'm on my way. But back in 1558, Elizabethan England, that wasn't a thing. We didn't have police like that. So the Justice of the Peace, they're controlling law and order in their local area. They're also carrying out Elizabeth's policies. They obviously listen to the court cases. If it's a serious crime, might be a higher court, and the courts would sit maybe every 3 months. So Elizabeth is using Lords Lieutenants and Justices of the Peace to help her control and govern England. Now, what else? would happen at a local level? Well, the justices of the peace might say, right, we've got to provide for the poor people. Remember I said right down the very bottom, we've got to provide for the poor. We've got to look after our roads. We've got to look after our bridges. It's a little bit like the council today, our local council, doing our important services so that we can exist in our day-to-day life. So when we look at how Elizabeth governed, yes, she's in total power, but she uses these people to help her govern the rest of the country. She's one person. She can't be everywhere at once. So she uses the lords, the nobles, the landowners, the lords lieutenants, the justices of the peace to help govern the rest of the people. So that was England, 1558. A very ordered society, a very structured society. Elizabeth at the top, with all the other people helping her to rule the country. So, that was England, but as we'll see, Elizabeth did face many challenges in 1558. She had many, many potential problems. Now, what were these problems? Aha! You need to wait for the next few videos, because we will look very carefully, hopefully very clearly, at the problems Elizabeth was facing as Queen of England in 1558. So, hope this one's been useful, looking at England as a society and how Elizabeth tried to govern that society, 1558. All the best now. I shall see you soon when we'll start looking at Elizabeth's problems. It's an emergency. Way. Speak to you soon.